The summer of 1885 brought drought and desperation to the Kansas territory. But for Magnus "Bear" Hutchinson, the massive cowboy who stood 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighed over 300 pounds, that scorching summer would bring something far more important than weather, a chance to prove that real strength is measured not by what you can destroy, but by what you're willing to protect, even when protection means risking everything you've built. Bear had spent 15 years building the Thunder Valley Ranch from nothing, turning worthless scrubland into one of the most successful cattle operations in 3 counties. At 41, he was respected throughout Kansas as a fair boss and an honest dealer, someone whose handshake was worth more than most men's written contracts. His enormous size made people nervous at first, but those who knew him understood that Bear was one of the gentlest souls who had ever walked the frontier, a man who rescued injured birds, spoke softly to frightened cattle, and had never raised his hand in violence except to protect those weaker than himself. But despite his success and his reputation, Bear was fundamentally alone. His size frightened most women, made children hide behind their mothers, and caused people to see him as more beast than man. He had accepted long ago that he would spend his life in solitude, building prosperity without anyone to share it with, working until his body gave out with no family to mourn his passing. That resignation was about to be shattered during what should have been a routine trip to Kansas City to sell cattle and purchase supplies. Bear had been in the city for 2 days, concluding his business and preparing to return to the ranch, when he witnessed something that made his blood boil with a rage he rarely allowed himself to feel. Walking past the city's notorious auction house, a place where desperate people were sold into indentured servitude under the thin legal fiction of labor contracts, he heard a woman screaming in protest as she was dragged onto the platform in chains. The woman was maybe 28 or 29, with auburn hair and green eyes that blazed with fury despite her obvious terror. She wore a widow's black dress that had seen better days, and she fought her captors with the desperate strength of someone who knew exactly what fate awaited her if she was sold to the wrong buyer. "I'm not property," she screamed, her voice carrying across the crowded street. "My husband's debts died with him. You have no legal right to sell me." The auctioneer's response was coldly efficient. "Your husband died owing $1,500 to legitimate creditors. Under territorial law, his widow can be sold into service to satisfy those debts. You'll work for whoever buys your contract until the debt is paid in full. Now, shut up and look presentable. You'll fetch more money if you're not screaming like a wildcat." And that's when Bear realized this wasn't just about witnessing injustice. It was about choosing whether to walk away from someone who needed help or risk everything he'd built to do what was right, which is exactly why you should hit that subscribe button right now, because watching how this gentle giant transforms from solitary rancher into fierce protector will restore your faith in human courage. Bear pushed through the crowd toward the auction platform, his massive size making people scramble out of his way. The bidding had started at $50 and was climbing quickly as men assessed the widow's worth as a servant, housekeeper, or worse. Bear listened to the leering comments and suggestive bids with mounting fury, understanding exactly what kind of service many of these men had in mind. When the bidding reached $300, an astronomical sum that reflected the widow's obvious beauty and the implication that she would be providing more than just household labor, Bear's deep voice cut through the noise like thunder. $2,000, cash money right now, and I want the debt contract destroyed, not transferred. This woman's going to be working for me, not serving anyone's twisted appetites." The crowd fell silent at the enormous sum and the threat implicit in Bear's tone. The auctioneer studied Bear's massive frame, his reputation clearly preceding him, and made a quick calculation about whether trying to cheat this particular buyer would be survivable. $2,000 for full contract satisfaction and destruction of debt. Sold to Mr. Hutchinson. Payment to be rendered immediately. Bear paid with a bank draft that represented most of his summer profits, then climbed onto the platform with surprising agility for someone his size. He carefully broke the chains binding the widow's wrists, his huge hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the raw flesh beneath the iron. "What's your name?" Bear asked quietly, ignoring the crowd's disappointed murmuring about losing their entertainment. The widow stared up at him with a mixture of shock and wary gratitude. "Eleanor. Eleanor Hartwell. Why did you pay so much for me? What do you want?" Bear's expression was grim but kind. "I want to take you away from this place and give you the chance to live free instead of being someone's property. I run a cattle ranch 2 days' ride from here. You can work there as my housekeeper in exchange for room and board until you figure out what you want to do with your life. And before you ask, I don't expect anything except honest work. I didn't save you from one kind of slavery just to force you into another. But you haven't seen the most important part yet. The ride back to Thunder Valley Ranch took 3 days instead of 2, because Bear insisted on stopping frequently to let Eleanor rest, to treat the wounds on her wrists, and to make sure she understood that despite his size and the fact that he'd purchased her contract, he had no intention of treating her as property. During those long days of travel, Eleanor's story emerged in pieces. She'd been married to a gambler named Robert Hartwell, who had died suddenly of a heart condition, leaving her with massive debts she'd known nothing about. His creditors had invoked an obscure territorial law that allowed them to sell a widow into indentured servitude to recover money owed, and Eleanor had been given no opportunity to contest the arrangement before being chained and put up for auction. "I thought American law prohibited slavery," Eleanor said on the second evening as they made camp under the stars. "How can they legally sell people?" Bear's expression darkened. "They call it debt servitude and claim it's different because it's supposedly temporary. But it's slavery in everything but name, and it's legal because powerful men profit from it and lawmakers look the other way. I've seen good people destroyed by it, worked to death, abused, treated worse than animals. That's why I paid so much for your contract. I couldn't walk away knowing what would have happened to you." Eleanor studied this enormous man who moved through the world with careful gentleness, who spoke softly despite his intimidating appearance, and who had spent a fortune saving a complete stranger from a fate worse than death. "Why? You don't know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible person who deserves what happened." "Nobody deserves to be sold like livestock," Bear said firmly. "And I know enough about you from watching you fight on that platform. You've got courage, dignity, and the kind of spirit that refuses to surrender even when everything seems hopeless. Those are the qualities of someone worth saving. Wait, don't miss what happens next." When they arrived at Thunder Valley Ranch, Bear's 5 ranch hands stared in shock at the sight of their massive boss riding in with a beautiful woman seated in front of him on his horse, his protective arms wrapped around her as if she were made of precious glass. "Boys," Bear said as he helped Eleanor down from the horse with surprising gentleness, "this is Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. She's going to be our housekeeper, and I expect you to treat her with complete respect. Anyone who so much as looks at her wrong will answer to me personally. Are we clear?" The ranch hands, who had worked for Bear long enough to know he meant every word, nodded quickly. "Yes, boss. Welcome to Thunder Valley, ma'am." Bear showed Eleanor to the small but comfortable cabin he'd built years ago, hoping someday to house a family that had never materialized. "This will be your private space. The main house has a bedroom for me and a spare room you can use as an office or whatever you need. You'll have complete privacy, locked doors, and my word that no one will bother you here." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Bear, I can't repay you for what you've done. $2,000 is more money than I'll ever earn, and you gave it away to save a stranger." Bear's smile was gentle despite his intimidating appearance. "You don't owe me repayment, Eleanor. You owe me honest work as a housekeeper, which is something I need anyway since this place has been run by 5 bachelors for too long. Beyond that, you owe me nothing except the promise that you'll use this chance to build whatever life you want instead of the one that was forced on you." Over the following weeks, Eleanor transformed Thunder Valley Ranch from a functional but stark bachelor operation into something that felt almost like a home. She cooked meals that actually tasted good instead of just providing fuel. She organized the chaotic bunkhouse into something livable. and most importantly, she brought a feminine presence to the ranch that softened some of the hard edges of frontier life. But more than her practical skills, Eleanor brought something Bear hadn't realized he was missing: intelligent conversation, genuine companionship, and someone who saw past his intimidating exterior to the gentle soul beneath. She asked about his life, his dreams for the ranch, his experiences building something from nothing. She shared her own story of a brief marriage to a man she'd barely known, the shock of discovering his debts after his death, and the terror of being sold like property by a legal system that seemed designed to destroy rather than protect vulnerable people. "You saved my life," Eleanor said one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the prairie in impossible colors. "But more than that, you saved my dignity. You could have bought me and treated me as most men would have, as property to be used however you wanted. Instead, you've given me respect, safety, and the first peace I've known since my husband died." Bear was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that looked tiny in his massive grip. "Eleanor, I want you to know something. In 6 months, I'll have made enough from the fall cattle sale to cover what I spent buying your contract. After that, you're free to leave if you want. I'll pay your passage to wherever you want to go, set you up with enough money to start fresh, no obligations or expectations. You don't owe me your future just because I helped you in your past. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what comes next." Eleanor stared at him in shock. "You'd let me leave? After spending so much money, you'd just let me walk away?" "Of course," Bear said, as if the answer should be obvious. "I didn't buy you to own you, Eleanor. I bought you to free you. What you do with that freedom is entirely your choice, and it always will be. If you want to stay here and keep working as my housekeeper, I'd be grateful for your help and your company. But if you want to go to California or back east or anywhere else, I'll help you get there because that's what freedom means." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, a knot of fear and shame she'd been carrying since her husband's death, suddenly releasing under the weight of Bear's unconditional generosity. "What if I don't want to leave? What if I want to stay here, not as your housekeeper, but as something more?" Bear's breath caught in his throat, afraid to hope that she might mean what he thought she meant. "Eleanor, I'm not the kind of man women usually choose. I'm too big, too intimidating, too kind," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Too gentle despite your strength. Too honest in a world full of liars. Too decent for a woman like me to deserve, but hoping maybe you'll choose me anyway because I've fallen completely in love with you, despite knowing it probably makes me a fool." Bear stood up from his chair, crossed the porch in 2 long strides, and knelt before Eleanor so he could look into her eyes without towering over her. "You're not a fool. You're the bravest woman I've ever met. And I love you too, not because I saved you, not because you work for me, but because you've reminded me what it feels like to have someone to talk to, someone to share meals with, someone who makes this ranch feel like more than just a place where I work until I die." Their first kiss was tender and patient, this massive man and this resilient woman discovering that the most unlikely partnerships often create the strongest bonds. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor was smiling through happy tears. "I'm not leaving, Bear. Not in 6 months, not ever, unless you want me gone. This ranch feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived, and you feel more like family than anyone I've ever known." The proposal came naturally a month later, during the first snow of winter when the prairie transformed into a white wonderland. Bear had been building Eleanor a hope chest, beautiful craftsmanship that showed both his skill and his intention. When he presented it to her filled with quilts and linens he'd commissioned from town, Eleanor understood what he was asking. "Eleanor Hartwell," Bear said, taking her hands in his enormous ones, "I went to Kansas City to sell cattle and buy supplies. Instead, I found the missing piece of my life standing on an auction platform, refusing to surrender her dignity despite impossible circumstances. You've transformed this ranch from a place where I merely existed into a home where I actually live. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend my life proving that buying your freedom was the best investment I ever made and that loving you is the greatest privilege I could receive?" Eleanor threw her arms around his massive neck, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes, Bear Hutchinson. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build a life with you on this beautiful ranch. And yes, I'll spend every day grateful that you were brave enough to step up when everyone else walked by, and generous enough to give me freedom even though you could have demanded servitude." The wedding took place in the spring, with Bear's ranch hands serving as witnesses and half the territory attending, because word had spread about the giant cowboy who'd spent a fortune saving a widow from slavery and then fell in love with her anyway. When the preacher asked if Bear took Eleanor as his wife, his answer rang across the prairie with absolute conviction. "I take this woman who showed me what real courage looks like when she refused to surrender her dignity on that auction platform. I promise to use my strength to protect her freedom, my gentleness to nurture her dreams, and every day of my life to prove that she made the right choice, trusting a man whose appearance frightens most people, but whose heart was big enough to recognize her worth when others saw only property." Eleanor's vows were equally powerful. "Bear, you saved me from being sold into slavery, but more than that, you saved me from believing I had no value beyond what men could use me for. You've shown me that real strength is always gentle, that real love is always respectful, and that the biggest hearts come in the most imposing packages. I promise to value your gentleness as the gift it is, to honor your courage in risking everything to do what was right, and to build with you a life where both of us are valued for who we are rather than what we look like." Years passed, and Thunder Valley Ranch flourished under Bear and Eleanor's joint management. Eleanor proved to have a natural talent for ranch finances and horse breeding, transforming Bear's already successful operation into one of the most prosperous in Kansas. They raised 5 children who grew up understanding that their father's size made him look dangerous, but that real danger came from people who used their power to hurt others rather than protect them. Bear never forgot the auction platform where he'd found Eleanor, and Thunder Valley Ranch became known as a sanctuary for people escaping debt servitude and other forms of legal exploitation. Bear used his wealth and influence to help dozens of people buy their freedom, always offering them the same choice he'd given Eleanor: work for fair wages with dignity or take money for a fresh start somewhere else, no obligations attached. On their 20th anniversary, as they watched their children working with the cattle, Eleanor reflected on the day Bear had stepped onto that auction platform and changed her life forever. Do you ever regret spending so much money to save a stranger? $2,000 could have bought a lot of things. Bear pulled her close, this woman who had transformed his lonely existence into a life filled with love, purpose, and joy. Not for 1 second. That $2,000 bought me freedom too. Freedom from loneliness, from believing I'd die alone, from thinking my size made me unlovable. You were the best investment I ever made, Eleanor, not because of what you could do for me, but because loving you taught me that the bravest thing a person can do is risk everything to protect someone else's dignity. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that real strength is measured by what you protect rather than what you destroy, then you've found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Romance Stories for more tales of courage, protection, and love that grows from the willingness to risk everything for what's right. From auction platforms to prosperous ranches, every story we tell proves that the greatest transformations happen when someone is brave enough to step up when everyone else walks by. This is where gentle giants find love, where enslaved widows find freedom, and where the most unlikely rescues lead to the most beautiful partnerships.